Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome back to our series, Muhammad, the Man Who Changed the World, episode 18. And we will talk about the events of the Battle of Uhud, the second battle of Islam. This happened the third year after the Hijrah. The Muslims are 700 men. Medina is being invaded by an army of 3,000 men of Quraysh. And the Prophet had chosen a strategic location at the hill of a mountain called Uhud, and that's why the battle is called Uhud, because it happens at the foot of a mountain. And the Prophet chose, because he's smaller in number, he chooses a strategically favorable position where he has the mountain protecting, let's say, two sides of the army, the back of the army and the right wing of the army. And then he has this open plain where the battle will occur, but smack bang in the middle of that plain, there is a little elevation, is a little hill. And the Prophet places 50 archers on that hill. And he gives very clear instructions to the archers, and he says to them, stay here and do not move. No matter what happens, do not move. And so the battle begins. And again, we take little bits of stories of different incidences. We know that very early on, the likes of Ali radiallahu anh, and Hamza, the uncle of Rasulullah, and Abu Dujana, who we spoke about last week, the last episode, who had the sword of Rasulullah, they inflicted heavy casualties on the Quraysh. Within the first, half an hour or so, the Quraysh's flag falls. So very early on, the Quraysh's flag falls. And we said that last week, last episode, there were 13 men that were designated to carry the flag. And so one by one, the flag bearer is attacked, is killed, the flag falls, the next one picks it up until all 13 of them are taken out and the flag is not picked up by anybody. So this was hugely demoralizing for Quraysh. Also, there are reports of Abu Jana being fighting so deep in the enemy territory with the flag, or with the sword of the Prophet, that he comes upon a soldier, a small looking soldier, who is basically stabbing all the injured Muslims. So this soldier is lagging behind, and it's, the soldier is poking and killing wounded Muslim soldiers, and Abu Jana wants to strike the soldier, and when he is about to hit this Quraysh screams and he realizes it's a lady, that this is a lady, and not just any lady. This is the wife of Abu Sufyan, the wife of the general. So if you can imagine how much the Quraysh must have retreated, or how disorientated they were, that Abu Jana could pierce the entire enemy line. He could enter almost the camp of the Quraysh and he could almost kill or capture the wife of the enemy general. That shows you how much the Quraysh buckled and folded, and many of them had fled. Many of the Quraysh just dropped their positions and they had fled. And so Uhud will be characterized by two halves. The first half, the Muslims completely overwhelmed the Quraysh. It was almost an extension of the Battle of Badr, and the Quraysh find themselves unable to fight back. They get pushed off the battlefield and they flee. It's in this time also, interestingly, that even though the Muslims winning, that one of the major companions loses his life in this battle. So there are quite a number of very, very famous shuhada. So there will be a number of famous Muslims that die in this battle. And perhaps the most famous of them is Hamza radiallahu anh. So if you remember Hamza, just taking you back a few episodes, Hamza was perhaps one of the first men to embrace Islam and make Islam strong. That same week, Hamza and Umar embraced Islam and Islam becomes strong. And Hamza was the uncle of the Prophet. At Badr, he had stepped forward for the Mubaraza. At Badr, he had killed his enemy and assisted in killing a second combatant. And so Hamza radiallahu anh, he again in Uhud makes significant damage to the Quraysh, but he is going to be killed. And how does he get killed and why is he killed? He is being targeted by an assassin. So there is a man on the battlefield. And his name is Wahshi. Wahshi was a spear thrower, an expert spear thrower. He is contracted to join the Quraysh, and his job is only to kill Hamza. He has no interest in the battle, he has no interest in Islam, he has no interest in anything else, but he's been sort of selected to kill Hamza. And why? Who's paying him? Remember I mentioned that lady, the wife of the enemy general, she has come to the battlefield because her father was killed by Hamza. So Hamza killed her father at the Mubaraza in Badr. And Hamza also killed her uncle and assisted in killing her brother. And so Hamza, she blamed Hamza for killing, her relatives. And so she pays this assassin and says to him, if you kill Hamza, you'll get your freedom. And so this assassin who later on becomes Muslim, he explains what happened. And he said that he was at Uhud, he had no interest in the battle, but he was watching Hamza. His job was just to kill Hamza. And he's watching Hamza and he's looking at Hamza and he sees how amazing, how Hamza is fighting like a lion. And he stalks him, and Hamza was killing somebody or fighting somebody. His back was turned, and Wahshi looked at the opportunity and he threw this spear, this javelin, with all his might, and it pierces Hamza and it kills Hamza basically. So Hamza is killed early on in the battle. He was targeted, but by and large the Muslims are completely dominating the Quraysh, and the Quraysh flee and they leave their belongings. Once again, they leave their armor, they leave their swords, they leave everything. They just jump on their camels and they leave the battlefield. And so the battle is sort of, it appears within an hour or two, the battle is over. And the archers were stationed there, and they kept preventing the Quraysh cavalry from flanking the Muslims. So the Quraysh, as we said, they had a cavalry, the Muslims didn't really have cavalry, and the head of the cavalry of the Quraysh, the man leading the cavalry, will become perhaps the most legendary general in the history of Islam. At this point in time, he's not a Muslim. And of course, everybody knows him as Khalid ibn Walid. Khalid, the sword of Allah. He will become the great general of Islam. Today, at the Battle of Uhud, he's not a Muslim, and he's heading up the Quraysh cavalry. And he tried, strategically to outflank the Muslims, but every time the archers would shower arrows on him and his cavalry, and they would be forced to retreat. And so the entire Quraysh army retreats, but Khalid does not retreat. He moves his cavalry off the battlefield, and he monitors the battlefield from a type of valley. And if you go to the battlefield where Uhud occurred, you have the mountain, you have the area of the battle, you have this little hill with the archers on, and then you have almost a huge, ditch in the ground, a valley, where you could actually hide in that ditch, in that valley, and nobody would see you. And so Khalid radiallahu anh moves his cavalry inside this valley. The Muslims don't see him there, and he is monitoring the battlefield, waiting for a moment, waiting for the archers to leave their position. And this is monitoring the archers. So the archers, they on this hill, the Quraysh have run away, and all in front of them is this open battlefield where there is war booty. The Muslim army had chased and pursued the Quraysh. So the Muslim army had also become disorganized, and they were, moving. And there was some of the army that the Muslims had also, become relaxed. They were picking up the war booty, and the archers are saying, the guys, the battle is over. We've won the battle. Everyone is collecting their spoils of war. We should go and get our share. And the general, the commander of the archers said, no, we have very strict instructions not to take the spoils of war. So originally there were 10 of the archers said, let's go and let's take the spoils of war. The majority said no. But then half an hour goes, an hour goes, and as time goes along, more and more of the archers said, what are you waiting for? The battle is finished. The enemy has left. And the general of the army said, I haven't yet received instructions that I may leave, and my instruction to stay. And in spite of this, 40 of the 50 archers defect. 40 of them said, look, I don't know about you guys, but battle is over, battle is done. And they defect, they leave their positions, and the 40 go down the hill to go and collect the war booty. Meanwhile, Khalid's cavalry is monitoring, and the minute this happens, they charge. They come up and they charge the archers. They kill the 40 that had left their positions, and then they summit, they climb the hill, they kill the remaining 10. And so, subhanAllah, Khalid takes over the position, and he is now in control of the battlefield. And they are able to encircle the Muslims. The Muslims are caught completely unawares, and the cavalry of Khalid is able to deal significant havoc. And so even though this was not the main Quraysh army, the cavalry alone was 200 men, and the Muslims, their whole army was 700, and the Muslims were scattered. And so there were also the 700 camels that they had. And so the cavalry of Khalid is able to inflict significant damage against the Muslims, and they're able to kill a number of companions. And of those who are killed is Mus'ab, none other than Mus'ab bin Umayr. Of course, he's going to be a primary target because he's carrying the flag of Islam. He's the flag bearer, he's carrying the flag, and so he is surrounded by group of Qurayshis, and they very brutally, it's mentioned in the books, that they strike with his hand that carries the flag, his right hand, he's carrying the flag with the right, and he's holding the sword with the left. They strike with his right hand, and he picks up the sword he picks up the flag with his left hand, and he's holding it up for dear life, and they strike his left arm, and he picks up the flag with his stumps. Subhanallah, what a lion! And then he is completely jumped on, and he is killed. So the flag of the Muslims fall, and it's the very, very first time in the history of Islam that the flag of Islam falls in the battlefield. Mus'ab radiallahu anhu is killed. They are, of course, looking for one main target, and that is the Prophet ﷺ. And when the Prophet ﷺ is made aware that he is, things have turned, the Sahaba say, Ya Rasulullah, you need to flee, you need to leave the battlefield because you will be targeted. And the Prophet ﷺ, in spite of the suggestions of his companions, he pushes forward and he shouts to the Sahaba, "Oh, my companions, come, you're being attacked from behind." He gives out his position and he instructs the companions to rally around him. And in that commotion, he gives his position away, and a group of the Quraysh charge at him, and he is caught up in a battle. Arrows are being thrown at him, rocks hit him, and even one of them is able to strike him in the face, and he loses a tooth, and his armor pierces his cheek. And some of the Sahaba believed, the rumors began to spread that we killed Muhammad, and he died. And when the message, there's so much confusion, there's some of the companions heard Muhammad has died, the flag has fallen. It appears for them that the battle is over. Many of them just give up, drop their swords, they collapse. Some of them flee from the battlefield. Some of them say, what is the point of all of this? They're completely demoralized, and it appears like the Prophet has died in the midst of the battle, that he was killed by Khalid's counterattack. Of course, the Prophet is not dead, and instead he's able to escape. And when he is struck in his face, he's bleeding, and he is surrounded by 9 defenders. The Prophet ﷺ is perhaps, this is the most vulnerable time that he's ever been in his life. Him with 9 defenders. 7 of them are from Medina, the Ansar, and 2 of them, 2 very famous companions. We should know their names. Their names are Sa'ad ibn Abi Waqqas and Talha ibn Ubaydillah. Side note, there are 10 very famous companions who are referred to as the Ashra al-Bashar, 10 who had received the good news. There are 10 companions who were given the news that they will enter Jannah. They were given they were foretold that they will enter Jannah. And these are the royalty, the best of the best of all the companions. And many of us, most of us, we should know all 10. And many of you know at least 4 of them, Abu Bakr, Umar, Ali, and Uthman and Ali, the 4 caliphs of Islam. They are, of course, of the 10. And then you have a few others, Abu Ubaidah, Abdurrahman ibn Auf, and these 2 Sahaba that are with the Prophet, Sa'ad and Talha. So Sa'ad and Talha, remember their names, they are with the Prophet as an elite guard. So the Prophet is surrounded by 9 defenders, 7 from Medina, Sa'ad and Talha, the other 2, and that's 9. And the Madani, the Sahabas of Medina, they said, we need to get you off the battlefield, and we need to go, and we suggest we climb Mountain of Uhud. So these are people of Medina, they know Uhud, they know all the different paths, the hiking paths, where the caves are. They said, let us move off the battlefield and let us run up the mountain. So you have, imagine this, the Prophet with 9 defenders, and they are running up the mountain, and they're being chased by a squadron of Khalid's cavalry, or as much as the horses can go up, and footmen, and they are shooting at the Muslims. And so this party of 9 companions with the Prophet are being chased. And every now and then, one of the Ansaris would say, you guys go ahead, and I'll stay behind to block them off. And really something out of a movie. You'd find that the 8 would go and 1 would remain behind, and then that one would get killed, and then the next one would say, you guys go and I'll remain behind. And so one by one, the defenders are being cut off, until what is left is the Prophet ﷺ with just the remaining 2, Sa'ad and Talha. And this is perhaps the most vulnerable moment in his life. And just as the moment was at the most critical, the Prophet ﷺ was alone with Talha and Sa'ad, and he's alone. The Prophet gets an arrow in his cheek, and Talha is defending the Prophet with his body, with his life, taking so many sword hits that his arm becomes paralyzed. In fact, there's a hadith where the Prophet says, if you want to see a martyr, a living shaheed, a man who's a shaheed already, but he's living, it is Talha because of what he had done in Uhud. Finally, reinforcements come, and when the Muslims hear that the Prophet is still alive, they come and they come to assist, and he is finally relieved. And so the Prophet, peace be upon him, he's not fully out of the woods. There are still enemies chasing after him. One of the companions said, please, they would say, there's a hadith where they would say, Ya Rasulullah, please stand behind us, our chest for your chest, our chest for your chest, our body for your body, because he wants to fight. And they said, no, you can't fight. He's got already, you can imagine, he's got a sword hit on the one side, he's got an arrow sticking out on the other side, and they're telling him, please stay back. And many of the Sahaba are trying to defend him and keep him from the battlefield. And we have many of the companions, as we said, some had been killed, some received tremendous amounts of wounds. Abdurrahman ibn Auf, for example, we spoke about him in Badr, one of the 10 from Jannah. He mentions that he had 20 wounds on Uhud. We also mentioned Sa'd ibn Abi Waqqas, because he was firing the arrows, he was also hit. Abu Dujana, the man with the red bandana and with the sword, he lost the eye in Uhud. And the Prophet himself, as we said, was hit a number of times with an arrow and with a sword hit. And when Prophet was finally sort of in a position of safety, Abu Bakr said that we saw his face bleeding, and we wanted to remove the arrow from his cheek. And of course it's quite delicate, you can't do it. One of the companions, Abu Ubaidah, again, one of the 10 promised Jannah, so these are the elite Sahaba, he could not get the arrow out, and so he used his teeth, he bit on the arrow, and he pulled the arrow out in a very difficult manner, and in that his own teeth broke off, both his front incisors broke off. But of course, as we said, that the man who had won the day for Muslims was Talha, who had defended with his whole body and with his life. And so when the Prophet, himself bleeding, hurt, and the Quraysh and many of his companions killed or injured, the Prophet says, in a moment of frustration, in a moment of anger, he says, how is it that Allah will ever forgive a people who strike the face of the Prophet? I'm coming to guide you to paradise. I'm coming to call you to paradise, and you hit me in my face. How can Allah ever forgive you? And one of the ayat in Surah Al-Imran that we recite is a response to the statement. Allah responds from then and there, but later on Allah says, لَيْسَ لَكَ مِنْ أَمْرِ شَيْءٍ أَوْ يَتُوبَ عَلَيْهِمْ أَوْ يُعَذِّبَهُمْ فَإِنَّهُمْ ظَالِمُونَ. Allah says to the Prophet, this is after the battle, that you had no right to say that. Not for you, O Muhammad, is the decision whether Allah forgives, shows mercy to some, or He punishes others, even though they are sinners. Allah says, yes, what they did was wrong, but the matter of forgiveness and punishment belongs to Allah. So subhanAllah, it's amazing that even in this moment, and He's only human, that you cannot say Allah will punish this one or Allah will forgive that. And then, of course, after his emotions had calmed, after he had reflected on this ayah, he said, oh Allah, forgive my people, for they know not what they do. They don't fully understand. So now what happens is the Muslim army had basically retreated up the mountain. They are in the mountains, they have sort of camping in the mountains. The Qurayshi army were scattered and regrouped, and they come and they line up, and they occupy the battlefield. And Abu Sufyan, the general of the army, he now takes control of the battlefield, and he inspects the dead. And he finds that many of his soldiers are beginning, and obviously since dead bodies all around, the Quraysh start to mutilate and disfigure and cut up the bodies of the Muslim shuhada. They are taking off the noses and the ears, and subhanAllah, it's all even mentioned that on the battlefield, when things were so bad and news was reaching the Muslims that there were many of them were killed and injured, that some of the ladies went out to go and support them and bring water and act as a nurse. And very interesting, we have a hadith in Bukhari that Aisha radiallahu anha, Aisha, the wife of the Prophet, she was present on the battlefield, and she was bringing water to the Muslims, the injured Muslims, and she was treating the injured, and she was running back and forth, bringing water, and she hiked up her dress. Her dress was hiked up, and then you could see that she had a bracelet on her ankles. Nonetheless, the Muslims are camping to one side on the mountains. Abu Sufyan has taken control of the battlefield. And now Abu Sufyan, he basically, he comes out and he addresses the Muslims. The Muslims are up in the mountains. He sees them, but of course there is a distance. And he now gives a speech. And he says to them, he shouts out, "Oh Muslims, or oh Sabians," we call them different names. He says, "Is Muhammad among you alive? Is he still alive?" And the Prophet says, "Shh, don't say anything." And then he says, "Is Abu Bakr alive?" And again, no response. And he says, "Is Umar alive? Tell me, is Muhammad alive? Is Abu Bakr alive? Is Umar alive?" And he only asked about those three. But it's interesting, again, side note, even Abu Sufyan understood who is the leadership of the Muslims, the Prophet, Abu Bakr and Umar. And then Abu Sufyan says, "As for those three, we have relieved you of them. We have killed them. We have killed you. We have killed them." And Umar, couldn't hold his anger, couldn't hold his frustration. And he says, "Oh enemy of Allah, those whom you have just mentioned, I tell you, are still alive." Umar couldn't control himself, his blood's out. "We're still alive. Allah has kept alive what you hated." And the Prophet ﷺ said to Umar, "Don't give our positions away." Abu Sufyan then says, "Muslims, we have defeated you, and you would have seen that there is mutilation amongst your dead. And I want you to know that even the dead, your bodies, your dead, have been mutilated. I didn't order it. I didn't tell them to do so, but I don't mind that it was happened." Abu Sufyan then says, "Hubal be praised." Now, Hubal was the name of the main idol. And so he said, "Hubal be praised, and Hubal is great, and he's praising his idol." And now the Prophet said to Umar, don't say anything, don't engage with him. He says, respond to him. And respond to him by saying, "Allah is Akbar." You say, "Hubal is great, Allah is greater." And then, again, Abu Sufyan praises idol Uzza. Al-Uzza be praised. And the Prophet says, respond that there is no Uzza, there's no greatness or there's no victory except Allah. Say, "Allah is our protector, and you have no protector." Abu Sufyan then says, and now there's a back and forth argument with responding. Abu Sufyan says, "A day for a day. 1-1. What does that mean? You want Badr, we want Uhud. It's 1-1. And then the Prophet, he tells Umar to say, "No, it's not equal, because our dead are in Jannah, the men that we have lost are in Jannah, where your dead is in Jahannam." So every time Abu Sufyan says something, Umar is responding with something else. So then the Quraysh are saying, "You see, he's dead. The fact that Umar is talking shows he's dead. Muhammad is dead, it's over." So Abu Sufyan says, "Come Umar, please, just be honest with me. Tell me, is Muhammad alive or not? I want to know if he's dead or not." And so Umar says, "No, he is alive. He's with us, and he's listening to all our words." And when Umar said that, interestingly, Abu Sufyan says, "I trust you more than Ibn Qamiyyah." Ibn Qamiyyah is the guy who said, "I killed Muhammad, I killed Muhammad." Right? So Ibn Qamiyyah is the enemy, is the Qurayshi guy. And the fact that when Abu Sufyan blurts out, he says, "Well, I trust Umar more than you, Ibn Qamiyyah, and therefore if Umar says he's alive, then he is still alive." And so Abu Sufyan, once again, he parades and they pump up, and then he says, "Come, let us go." And they leave the battlefield and they head towards Mecca. And after the Quraysh had left, the Muslims come down the hill. It's still, Saturday, still the afternoon or so, and they begin to inspect all the bodies of the Muslims that have been killed. And subhanAllah, many of the great Sahaba that were killed, they find Hamza radiallahu anhu. Hamza was not only killed, he was mutilated. His ears, his eyes, his nose was all cut off. His intestines were taken out, and obviously a horrible sight. They also came upon the body of certain Sahaba who were unrecognizable because they were hit and they were disfigured by the Quraysh. And then they came upon one of the saddest, one of the men that really hurt, everybody was sad obviously, but one of the bodies that really hurt everybody was the body of Mus'ab, the flag bearer. The Muslims obviously of Makkah would have grown up with him. The people of Medina would have loved that he brought Islam to them. And so they found him like that. And when they wanted to wrap up his body, there was this collective grieving because he didn't have enough of a garment to cover his body. When they would cover his head, his feet would be open. When they cover his feet, his head would be open. So he didn't have enough clothing, and his arms were off. And as they were kind of, wrapping and moving his body, the Ansar were crying. They were very, very sad, because this was the man, this was the Sheikh, this was the man that made them Muslim. And the Muslims of Mecca said, you guys are sad looking at Mus'ab. But I will tell you, we remember Mus'ab when he used to only wear silk. We used to remember him when he only wore the best of clothing. Because I remember him being a young man, driving around Makkah in his Ferrari, having all the luxuries, and now here he is in the dust, in the sand. He didn't even have enough kafan. And so after they had taken stock, the Muslims had lost over 70 men, and the Quraysh had lost over 35 men. And amongst them, as we said, Hamza was killed, Mus'ab was killed, a few other senior companions were killed, and the Muslims were completely devastated and traumatized, and the Muslims now stayed on the battlefield, and they began the burial process. So they began to dig graves, because there were 70 people. To dig 70 graves was too much, and so the Muslims basically dug about 30 graves. And of the Muslims, the majority of the bodies were mutilated. SubhanAllah, the majority of the dead, their bodies were mutilated, and of course this added to the injury and the insult to Muslims. And so they dug these graves, and they placed 2 or 3 per grave. 2 or 3 bodies were placed in there, and the Sahaba said, is there any order that we should bury them? Who do we put in first? And the Prophet said, the most knowledgeable one of those who of the Quran, the most knowledgeable of them who have known the Quran, should be buried first. And so, subhanAllah, interesting side note, that even, and he says he will be the Imam, in the grave he will be the Imam. So interesting side note, that even the Hafiz, or the one who knows the most Quran, in death is honored. And so these graves, the Muslims were buried there. This is not the main burial site in Medina. For those of you who know, who've been to Medina, you know that the main cemetery of Medina is Baqi. It's next to the masjid. This is somewhat out, because also would have been difficult to transport 70 bodies to the cemetery, and also chosen the shuhada of where they died. And so if you visit the battlefield of Uhud, you'll find an area where you have the shuhada being buried. So the Muslims are burying their dead. They are tending to their wounds. They are sort of regrouping and recovering, and the Prophet says to them, we will stay here. So the Prophet instructed the Muslims will remain on the battlefield the Saturday evening, and they would even stay the next day on Sunday, and they remained on the battlefield. They didn't return home. And of course, you can imagine, for those who were injured, to stay on the battlefield, sleep over, this was quite difficult. But of course, they regrouped and they waited. And the point is that if the Quraysh wanted to retaliate, they would be ready. The Quraysh are on their way back to Makkah, and on their way back to Makkah, they stopped and they have a meeting, and they said, well, we fought, we killed a few Muslims, we kind of won the battle, but what did we achieve? Remember, there was a clear list of reasons we fought Uhud. One, we wanted to avenge Badr, we wanted to open the caravan lines, we wanted to kill Muhammad, we wanted to destroy Islam. We didn't achieve any of this. We didn't achieve any of this. In fact, if you look at the numbers, Uhud, the Quraysh still lost more in Badr than the Muslims lost in Uhud. And so they thought to themselves, we didn't do anything. We should go back and finish the job. And they were on their way back to go and finish the job. The Muslims, of course, were there stationed. And the Prophet said, we will wait and we will fight them. That if they were to come, we would fight them. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala references this in the Quran in Surah Al-Imran, that the believers, that in their moment of injury, that they remained resolute. They were ready to fight round 2. And in fact, the Quraysh sends a scout apart to go and inspect the Muslims and look at the situation, and if they are in a shape to fight. And the scout goes and he sees them. They are injured, they are hurt, but they are extremely pumped and ready. And so he returns to the Quraysh and he says, listen, the Muslims are hurt, you've definitely killed a number of them, but this only increased their zeal. And if anything, they want vengeance. So if you were to come and fight them, then for every one of them that you fight against them to Badr, if for every one that you kill, you will take out at least one or two of them. So are you prepared to lose about 1,000 men fighting them? And the Quraysh decide, you know what, it's not worth it. Let's quit while we're here. And so in fact, the Quraysh turn around and they leave back to Mecca. And now once the news reaches that the Muslims had been, that the Quraysh had left completely, then they return to Mecca. The Prophet now allows the Sahaba to return to Medina. And of course, this was a very, very catastrophic moment for the Muslims. The Muslims suffered at Uhud their biggest defeat. In fact, the whole history of the Seerah, when we get to the end of Seerah, you'll find that Uhud was perhaps one of the most devastating moments. Even Aisha asks the Prophet, was there ever a day worse than Uhud for you? And the Prophet says, yes, the incident of Taif, which you spoke about, was worse. But in her mind, Uhud was the worst moment of his life. He almost got killed, he was struck in his face, many of his Sahaba were killed. And this was really a low point in the Ummah. And many of the ayat of Surah Al Imran will speak about this. And inshallah, in the next episode, we'll go through some of these verses because it gives us insight in our moment of sort of defeat, how we go through this. So join us inshallah for that. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.